Hello, and welcome to the first of our series of mini lectures. Since this is our first mini lecture, I wanted to begin by spending some time explaining to you what my goal and purpose is behind the mini lectures, so that you'll get a better sense of what it is that I'm attempting to do week by week as I post these. Let me begin by saying that my purpose is not to comprehensively cover everything that's in your book. All the things that are in your book I do regard as important, and you will need those things. So in this sense, the mini lecture will definitely not be a substitute for that, but rather to highlight some of the main points from your reading and from time to time to introduce some concepts that perhaps are not a part of your book to give you a little bit feel of the flavor of that. Oftentimes my goal is simply to give you some context for some of the points that are maybe raised in your book, as well as to give you a particular focus each week. So the mini lectures will be relatively short. Shorter obviously than the reading that you're having, but I definitely won't necessarily comment on everything that you're reading. And like I said, from time to time I'll be introducing some new material. Okay? So let's begin for this week. This week we're going to begin by first defining the term organizational development, which is a major aspect of organizational change. Because as we talk about leading organizational change in this class, we're going to be talking about leading it from what's called an organizational development perspective, and I'll talk a little bit more about that before. Let's begin first, however, by defining what we mean by organizations. Before we can develop them, we need to know what they are. One typical definition is that organizations are social entities, goal-directed, deliberately structured activity systems, and are linked to the external environment. Let me begin by kind of breaking this down a little bit by first talking about this idea of social entities. Organizations are made up of people. Essentially, if there aren't people in it, then it's not an organization, at least not in the sense of what we're talking about that term. So we're really talking about that there's a social aspect to organizations. They're goal-directed. Every organization has a mission. Therefore, it has a purpose. It has something that it's attempting to accomplish. The goals may vary from getting tasks done to facilitating human relations, but nonetheless there's a goal to every organization. Deliberately structured activity systems. This simply means that there's a structure to what we're talking about when we speak of organizations. And then finally, we're talking about the idea that are linked to the external environment. This is a very important concept that we take for granted when we talk about organizations today, but in many ways, many of the earlier conceptualizations of organizations were that they were sort of closed systems. And I'll get a chance to come back and talk about what I mean by this, perhaps by our fourth lecture on various models of organizational development. But it's very important to understand that organizations are very much linked to the environment in which they are placed. So when we talk about social entities, goal-directedness, deliberate structured activity systems, and entities that are linked to their external environments and therefore have to interact with those external environments, that's what we mean by the term organizations. Usually when we're looking at organizations, we're typically examining the variety of contextual dimensions of them, things such as size, goals and strategy, culture, environment, and technology. As it turns out, it is the variance along each of these 5 things that oftentimes become a part of the organization's identity. Large organizations tend to be different from small ones. Depending upon the goals and the strategies of an organization, they vary along those lines as well. So once again, the point is that one of the things that tends to determine the type of organization is going to be the degree to which they vary along these 5 contextual dimensions. So let's begin with a definition. In your book, your author provides you with at least 3. I've presented to you here the third definition, the author's own definition. which is organizational development, is the process of increasing organizational effectiveness and facilitating personal and organizational change through the use of interventions driven by social and behavioral science knowledge. Okay. I think the author has done a very good job of kind of packaging some of the core principles here in a minute that I'm going to come back and kind of walk you through. But before I do that, I decided I would give you yet a fourth definition, as if you needed another definition. But this one comes from one of the more popular texts out there, texts by Cummings and Worley, and so it's one of the more popular definitions. And their definition is that organizational development is a system-wide application and transfer of behavioral science knowledge to the planned development, improvement, and reinforcement of the strategies, structures, and processes that lead to organization effectiveness. Hopefully you can see the parallel between this definition and the one that you were just presented by Anderson. They capture some of the same essentials in that case. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through the 5 characteristics of OD that are embedded within the multiple definitions that exist. Okay. The first characteristic is that OD is typically focused on changes in things like strategy, structure, and processes of the entire system. And so OD is very much organization-wide focused in that case. Second characteristic of OD is that it's the application and transfer of behavioral science knowledge. OD is very much anchored into science, so it's not just anecdotal pieces of information, nor is it based solely on, say, a consultant's experience, but it's very much based upon transferring behavioral science knowledge. Behavioral science, in this case, simply being a term oftentimes used to refer to a number of disciplines such as psychology, sociology, organizational behavior, anthropology. You will find many facets of all of those different fields being used within OD. OD is also an adaptive process for planned change. It's adaptive in the sense that there is no rigid application of principles here. One of the things that an OD practitioner has to possess, and that is the ability to make what I oftentimes refer to as audibles. Oftentimes when we're working in an organization, you're going to have to be able to adapt whatever model that you're working with. But whatever that model is, it's typically a model for planned change. And so we'll get a chance to come back to this notion of planned change, but it simply means those steps that one ought to engage in to bring about change in either some incremental or large fashion. It is both the creation, but just as importantly, the reinforcement of change. The emphasis here is on that reinforcement part. Oftentimes you can make changes in an organizational context, but if you don't reinforce that change, things will simply revert back to the way that they were. Whatever forces that were keeping the organization in whatever status quo it was in the first place are likely simply to return that organization back to that original status in that case there. So OD has to concern itself just as much with how it's going to institutionalize that change as much as how it's going to bring about the change in the first place. It's oriented to improving organizational effectiveness. One of perhaps the biggest changes to the way that organizational development was considered is that very early on, OD was much more focused really around the people aspect of the formula, so it was more focused on bringing about healthy outcomes for people, and it wasn't so much focused on the bottom line of organizations. One of the things that's happened throughout the evolution of OD, and I'll incidentally talk more about that in my next mini lecture on the history of OD, but one of the things that happened was a greater focus on not just on improving the situation of people, but how do you improve organizations as a whole. And so in that sense, OD is just as much interested in improving organizational effectiveness as it would be, say, the effectiveness of individuals in the workplace. One of the things that I think it's very important to emphasize, and that is the importance of thinking of organizational development as a paradigm, more so than as a tool or technique or some particular method. And so in that sense, it's really more of an approach to how you might accomplish something than just some particular method. In fact, many of the methods that you will see presented as a part of this course in organizational development are used under other approaches. They're taught in other courses. And so there's actually very few tools and methods that are unique to OD. It's really more the approach that org development specialists take when they're doing that method. And so we'll have a chance to kind of make some distinctions here a little bit later, but it's also a process. So not only is it an approach, a philosophy, if you will, but it's also a process by which one brings about, once again, either incremental or large changes. Let's talk about what it's not. OD is not management consulting, in the sense that typically management consulting tends to be very specific. So say consulting in the area of accounting, for example, or consulting in the area of, say, business operations of some sort. Usually in that kind of consulting, people sort of come in and they're very directly going to be working on some particular kind of problem. Once again, if you recall, one of the principles of organizational development is that it's organization-wide. And so OD would not be focusing very narrowly, nor would it necessarily call for having expertise in some narrow area. Also, OD is not training and development. This is very important because OD may actually involve training and development. In fact, quite a lot of OD involves training and development, but it's not the same thing as that. This brings me back to my point that I made earlier about OD being an approach more so than just a particular tool or technique. Training and development is generally one tool or technique that a person might use to do a number of things. But OD is really more than that in this case. OD is not short-term. OD is definitely more concerned with the long term of an organization. An OD consultant oftentimes seeks to work with an organization on a long-term basis, primarily because of its emphasis on capacity building of an organization. This concept of capacity building is very important in the sense that it really refers to the desire to really leave an organization better off than it was when you entered it. Perhaps you're all familiar with the saying, feed a person, give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, teach them how to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. That latter notion of teaching people how to fish so as to feed them for a lifetime is very much this notion of capacity building that organizational development seeks to do, in the sense that you really are seeking to have the organization develop the expertise that you bring to it. In one sense, I think of myself as an organizational development consultant as attempting to work myself out of a job. If I've been successful, my client really shouldn't need me 2 or 3 years down the road. They should ultimately develop the same abilities that I'm bringing to them. Now, oftentimes that takes a little bit longer than 2 or 3 years down the road in that case, but that's at least my goal. And of course, that's going to require a long-term relationship more so than a short-term relationship. Finally, organizational development is not the mere application of a toolkit. Once again, the point that I've been making all along here. It's an approach, it's a philosophy, it's not just a set of tools. A toolkit can be used from a variety of different approaches, and it's very easy to confuse OD with a toolkit because oftentimes this is the way in which it's typically presented to would-be clients. A consultant oftentimes has to go into an organization, and you have to, in a very tangible way, say what it is that you plan to do in that organization. Generally, at that level, you're talking about the various tools and strategies that you have. But I think it's very important for the consultant to always point out to the client that it's really much more than just a toolkit. It's a certain approach that's going to involve certain core values that, once again, I'll get a chance to talk about here a little bit later. So I want to now shift and talk about then this course, as it's going to involve teaching you the principles and concepts of organizational development as a way of talking about leading organizational change. And so one of the first things that we're going to deal with in this course are a discussion of some of the principles and values of organizational development. In my next mini lecture, I'm going to talk about history and really point out to you how a number of the principles of organizational development have come about as a result of various movements that have occurred throughout the evolution of organizational development, and then talk very explicitly about some of these values that constitute, if you will, the philosophy, the approach, if you will, that I've been talking about. Then we're going to move and talk about some of the models that are used in organizational development, some of the main paradigms that govern these models. We'll talk about, and you'll see how very much these models, each of them have their own little twist to them. In some ways, you might imagine that many practitioners have found ways to incorporate various aspects of these models, and so we'll get a chance to look at some of that as well. And then we'll talk about the OD process. If you remember me referring to this idea of planned change, kind of referring to sort of this process in which one might engage in OD. So, for example, the initial contact that a consultant would have with a client is oftentimes referred to as the entry and contracting process of organizational development. And so we'll have an opportunity to look at that process and talk about what are some of the main questions, what are some of the main pieces of information that a OD consultant is attempting to gather when they go through that process. Also, what are some of the main things that you want to watch for, or in some cases, watch out for. Data gathering, which is a very important process. And this is oftentimes involved with attempting to really even understand the problem. For example, we'll talk about the difference between the presenting problem and the actual problem. And so we'll talk about how you gather data in those initial meetings to even begin to fully understand what you're doing. So in some ways, and let me say ahead of time that this OD process, though we're presenting these in steps, it's very important to understand that these steps are oftentimes overlapping, in the sense that the data gathering is typically taking place while the contracting process is still also taking place. Ultimately, the data gathering process leads to diagnosis and feedback, diagnosis of the problem and the viability of potential solutions. The diagnosis is oftentimes involving more than problems. It's also a diagnosis of the status of the client. To what degree is the client actually ready to make change? It's oftentimes the case that though you may very accurately know what the problem is, the client itself may not really be in the position to where they're willing to make the changes, and that's a very important piece that you have to learn to deal with. So once again, the diagnosis is not just on the nature of the problem, it's on the readiness and availability of the client to actually make change. And then the process of feeding back that information to the client. In OD, as you'll see, diagnosis is a joint process between both client and consultant. It's very important to have the client involved in that process. All right, moving along, then the process of engaging in interventions. These would then be those tools and methods that you might utilize to bring about any necessary forms of change. And then finally, assessing the impact or effectiveness of those interventions and assuming that the interventions prove to be effective, then moving to the point of institutionalization. How does one make sure that the change sticks? And that's what we refer to as the institutionalization. So essentially, these are going to be the pieces of content that we're going to be focusing on. Each of these pieces of content, week after week, have associated with them case studies that helped highlight some of the core principles among each of these. And so you'll be asked each week, after you had a chance to do your reading and perhaps listen to this mini lecture, you have the opportunity to engage in a conversation on these case studies that will perhaps help you to better understand the models or the OD processes that we'll be talking about. So I'll end this first mini lecture here and say that it is my hope that you'll find the future lectures enlightening and hopefully clear. And I'll say goodbye for now. Bye-bye.